right, it is 11 o'clock, so we shall begin. My name is Jana Hexter. I'm with the Northeastern IPM Center, and welcome everybody to our Toolbox webinar today, Combating Slugs as Pests of Soybeans and Corn, otherwise known as They Came in the Night. And I am delighted to welcome you here today. This is being recorded, and you will be receiving a link to the recording sometime next week. And so I have a few starter things before we begin the presentation. Whoops, so daisy, there we go. We welcome your questions and we ask you to do it in a specific way. It's hard for me to keep track, especially when there's a lot of people on the line. So we ask that you use the Q&A feature. So if you scroll your mouse over your screen, you should see a black toolbar that comes out from Zoom. And in that, there's a little box in the middle that says Q&A with two rectangles. And if you click on there, you can ask questions and you can do so anonymously. And that helps me because then if 3 people ask the same question, I can mark them as answered, but only ask it once. And it's much easier for me to keep track of than the chat. So I'll ask that you use that. I'm delighted today to welcome David Owens and Sally Taylor. So David Owens is a University of Delaware Agricultural Entomology Extension Specialist located at the Carville Research and Education Center in Georgetown, providing extension education and support for Delmarva field and vegetable field crops since 2017. His primary activities include performing crop pest surveys and scouting, maintaining pest monitoring traps, and conducting insect management trials. He contributes to regional field crop recommendation guides and participates in numerous extension-related meetings. Dr. Sally Taylor is an associate professor and field crops entomology extension specialist located at the Tidewater Agricultural Research and Extension Center in Suffolk, Virginia. Sally's program conducts research in corn, soybeans, small grains, peanut, and cotton. So welcome to both of you. And to begin, we have some questions for you. There are it's no pressure. So you can get the wrong answer, it's totally fine. It's not school. And I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes to answer these questions. It gives us a sense of who is on the call and the level of knowledge. And so I'll just be quiet while that happens. Okay, so you should be seeing the results here. So actually we have about 50-50 people who are practicing no-till and not, and some who it's just not applicable, and about 50-50 on row crops and vegetable crops. Most people have less than 10 acres, and then we have quite a few people who've got more than 400 acres. And how knowledgeable are people about the resources available to manage slugs? Somewhat knowledgeable, some not at all, and some moderately. And we've got a couple that are extremely. So great. All right, wonderful. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to do that. And with that, I will move the slides forward and ask for our presenters to begin their presentation.
Well, thank you, Jana. So I'm David Owens with University of Delaware, and I've got my contact info and Sally has hers here on the screen. If you have any questions or comments or concerns or even good jokes regarding our topic today, feel free to reach out to us anytime or to your local state extension entomology specialist. And one more thing I want to say before I begin, some folks ask, how do entomologists get roped into working with slugs? They're not insects. And, some of that's probably because when you see holes in leaves, who do you call? Do you call your agronomic fertilizer guy, or do you call your bug man that deals with other things that put holes in leaves? So that's how entomologists kind of got roped into this orphan pest, but it's a pest that's gaining quite a bit of significance. Next slide, please, Jana. So when we're starting a discussion on any pest, we really need to know the environment in which it is operating in. What's its basic ecology. And so that, to frame this discussion, we really need to start it off with a discussion on no-till agriculture in the Mid-Atlantic. The primary goal of no-till agriculture is to keep as much undisturbed residue from the previous crop on the soil surface. And there's several pros and cons for that. On the pro side, it helps to reduce erosion and it reduces compaction. We're not dragging heavy equipment across that field multiple times, which can help, which can contribute towards compaction layers in the subsoil. No-till is also associated with increasing water infiltration rates and holding capacity. On the Delmarva Peninsula, we have very sandy soils that only hold a couple of days worth of water in the summer months when corn is sucking up close to 1/3 of an inch a day. And so increasing the water holding capacity is really important, especially for us. Because we're not dragging heavy equipment through soil, we're reducing our fuel usage and wear and tear on equipment. But there has been an increase in herbicide use. And we're going to cover that in just a moment. Another benefit for no-till agriculture is one of policy. NRCS provides subsidies for no-till or strip-till adoption, usually in the range of $12 to $17 per acre. But with the benefits, there are a couple of downsides to no-till agriculture. Sally, would you like to make a comment on a couple of those?
Yes, so there can be increased nitrate leaching and runoff, which is largely offset by the use of cover crops and crop rotations. And there's also soil temperature moderation, so that insulates the plants from really high temperatures and really low temperatures, especially when they fluctuate quickly, as they're known to do in the spring and fall. But it can delay your planting in the spring because the ground isn't warm enough yet. Next slide, please, Jana.
So I mentioned that there's been an increased use in herbicides, and that's in part because of glyphosate and glyphosate tolerant crops. Since the mid-90s, when Roundup Ready corn and soybeans were first introduced, glyphosate use has really increased. It's a really powerful weed management tool. So, we've got the trade-off between disturbing the soil and getting rid of weeds at planting, or spraying a fairly environmentally benign product to kill those weeds instead. And glyphosate tolerant crops has also helped with the adoption and the management strategies behind cover cropping.
And this is my addition that in general, planting green is associated with fewer weed problems and more insect problems. And this is very region dependent. So you can read things out of Pennsylvania that show that planting green is associated with fewer pest problems for them because it provides a habitat not just for herbivores, but the predators of herbivores. As you travel farther south into Virginia, Tennessee, mid-southern regions and southeastern regions, it's associated with more pests. And I think that's just system specific. So we tend to have more bugs in the south because we're warmer. And leaving those habitats or those weeds and cover crops green allows the herbivores to carry over into your cash crop. Next slide, please, Jana.
Now, with the increasing use of particular herbicides and relying on herbicides in no-till agriculture, it's come a couple of additional challenges. Here on Delmarva, we have ragweed that is resistant to glyphosate, PPO herbicides, and ALS herbicides. We've got Roundup resistant mare's tail. And our extension weed scientist here is holding what some people call the devil weed. That's Palmer amaranth, which can produce just millions and millions of seeds. It's very resistant to my efforts at mechanically weeding it. And it's resistant to a lot of herbicide modes of action. Next slide, please. So that's where cover crops really enter into the mix. Cover crops are strongly encouraged in no-till production. From a pest management perspective, they help reduce weed competitiveness, and they help suppress weed seedling germination. So they can help with weed management, especially with some of these herbicide-resistant weeds. From an agronomic perspective, they can help with nutrient recapture. As Sally said, no-till agriculture can result in increased runoff and leaching, which is offset by cover crops. And some cover crops can help break up compaction. This is a picture of tillage radish root. It's probably about 8-10 inches deep in the soil. And typically in Delaware North, tillage radish will winter kill. Doesn't always, but it often does. And so when it winter kills, that taproot is going to slowly decompose during the early spring. So it helps also break up compaction and improve soil structure. Cover crops can help dry fields, and that's both a pro and a con. They can remove a lot of moisture from that field. So if you have a really wet spring, they can help get the soil ready, particularly if a thick cover crop is growing rapidly in like the mid-spring time period. But if the weather wobbles and turns dry, they can start sucking up all of the moisture that the seed needs to germinate and grow. And then they've got some other biological benefits. The brassicas and the legumes are tremendous resources for pollinators, both in terms of pollen and in nectar. Little trivia here. This is a picture of a honeybee collecting pollen off of crimson clover. And you can see on its hind leg, it's got this chocolatey brown pollen basket on its leg. Crimson clover makes a very chocolate colored pollen, which is pretty cool. But that's trivia. Next slide, please. Now, cover crops are not a new concept. Cover cropping has been practiced in the mid-Atlantic since the 1970s. And production small grains, while technically they don't quite count as a cover crop, they do fulfill some of the same principles in that we've got living, growing plant material on a field pretty much year round. Once those small grains are harvested, we come in behind it and plant soybeans or other crops. And USDA and NRCS and other programs have really encouraged adoptions with cover crop, and spending on cover crops have really increased since about the mid 2010s or so. And there has been a slight decrease in the amount of funding available for conservation tillage practices. Next slide, please. So NRCS provides subsidy incentives for cover crops, and they can be up to about $90 an acre. And then on top of that, there are state programs and incentives through tax credits, equipment rentals, conservation district assistance, and crop insurance rates to further encourage cover crop adoption. In Delaware, about a quarter of our acreage is in a cover crop program. In Maryland, it's almost 50%. And this graph here, it's from 2012, so it's a little bit dated, but it really illustrates how the mid-Atlantic area, Virginia to Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, really has some of the highest cover crop adoption rates in the country. Next slide, please. So if you want more information on cover crops, the Northeast SARE has put out a great pamphlet on no-till and cover crop practices and considerations. I'd encourage you all to check that out. Next slide, please. Now, unfortunately, our pests are really good at adapting and taking advantage of the changing agro ecosystem that's around them. This quote from Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, "Life finds a way," is very applicable. And for any computer game nerds out there, I used to play Half-Life a lot, and there's this really shadowy character in the Half-Life video game series called the G-Man, who's maybe says 5 lines in the entire half-life series, but one of those lines is to prepare for unforeseen consequences. And I think that's really applicable to the environment of no-till ag and cover crops and with slugs. Next slide, please.
Okay, this is my slide. You may have to click on the image, Yana, to get it to start spinning. But we get these questions a lot at winter meetings and at agricultural meetings of, why, Sally, David, why is this happening? This is so weird. Why is this happening to me now? And it's kind of an oversimplification to say climate change, but I think climate change has a very big role to play in what we're seeing and dealing with. And what this image on the right is doing is showing temperature anomalies for the past 100 years. So as that circle increasingly leaves that green line, it's showing that things are getting weirder, not necessarily warmer, but weirder. And these warmer, weirder things are favoring overwintering survival of slugs and other species. It's causing them to develop faster, and it's causing them to flip generations sooner. And in general, pests are going to be moving from the south to the north. Next slide, please. One of the things that's been happening in the Mid-Atlantic, this is from the USDA Climate Hub, and they have different regions with region-specific information on climate and weather. And all these images are over a decade old. They're very applicable because these trends are still happening. As you look here on the map on the left of the United States, you'll see that we're having an increase in very heavy precipitation. So what's going on? Well, we're getting the same amount of rain annually, but we're getting it in fewer rainfall events. So in the spring, we may get the same 12 inches in June that we always get, except now it's rained 3 times. And that's causing us issues with slugs, but also getting in and out of fields. And the picture on the right-hand side of the slide is giving you the similar or the same information, which is the increase in annual days that we're getting more than an inch of water at a time. Next slide, please. What else is going on is our falls are getting longer. So our frost-free season length is extending. So we're having warm weather into sometimes October, November, December. I mean, last Halloween, we couldn't even put the costumes on the kids because it was 100 degrees. So that's favoring build up these overwintering populations in the fall. Next slide, please.
And with those changes in fall weather, we also see some reduced wintertime mortality. You know, a lot of folks will ask me, particularly when we have a brief cold snap, are the bugs dying yet? And I say, hold your horses. They reproduce at such a high rate, you won't notice it by the time you're ready to plant your field. But in some ways, cold winters do help. And unfortunately, we're getting trends towards milder winters, increased soil moisture, especially in the wrong times of the year, increased residue coverage with no-till and cover cropping. And then we also have a trend towards earlier planting dates. This can be a function both of the mild winters, but also a function of the farm economy. Between 2008 and 2015, the number of farms in the country decreased almost 10%, whereas the average farm size has increased by a similar percentage. So some of the folks that I work with here on Delmarva that have the worst slug issues till several thousand acres. So they've got to start early as possible so that they can get across all of their ground in a good planting window. So we've got also some cultural practices and some agronomic reasons for planting earlier. And planting earlier can help with avoiding some late season pest issues or late season droughts. We also have some varietal improvement and to some extent a massive adoption of seed protection technology, both in terms of fungicide and insecticide. So that all helps crops do better and thrive a little bit better earlier in the season when the soil temperatures can be still cooler. This can be a double-edged sword though, especially with slugs. Our frost-free date in Delaware is like May 10th, May 13th. We can still, even with mild winters, we can still get cold snaps well into May. And 2 years ago, we had freezing weather on April 17th, 18th, and 19th, and then a frost on May 10th. So the soil temperature is basically stuck at about 50 degrees for a full month after some folks had already planted. In 2018, we had more than 7 inches of rain in the month of May. So all of those factors together can favor our friendly slug critters. Next slide, please. So by the time we're coming back to some of these fields after we've planted several thousand acres, you know, our corn has 4 or 5 leaves on it, and it's not looking as thrifty as it should. This here is a leaf. You know, some of the signs that we see, you get these really ragged holes in the leaves. And then if you hold those leaves up to the sunlight, you'll have these little glistening patches that reflect all the light. Those are very characteristic for slugs. Next slide, please. Here again, you can see the shredding on those leaves. Really, we don't have any other critters that do that to corn. Next slide, please. And with soybeans, what we see is that holes in the cotyledons, almost like somebody took a hole puncher to those cotyledons or a pencil and tried to drive that pencil through the plant. The soybeans on the left side have varying levels of damage. So you've got one seedling that's emerging and getting fed on. You've got another seedling that has been grazed on a little bit, but those unifoliate leaves are coming out nicely. And that's right next to a seedling that might have even had its growing point killed. The seedling on the right has had a whole cotyledon knocked off of it. And that's fairly typical for slug injury. Next slide, please.
Great, so this is where we take a quick break for questions. We actually haven't had very many come through yet. There is one from Mark Imlay. Are the slugs native or non-native?
So it's a bit of a mixed bag. And I'm going to cover this in a little bit, but we've got several common species of slug, and depending on where you're at in the country, some of the most important slugs are non-native. In some fields, you can get a mixture of both native and non-native. And then in other parts of the country, some of the most important slugs are the native complex. So it really is a mixed bag.
Great, and then we'll carry on. We'll have another Q&A break later on. So if you have more questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box in Zoom, and I'll be monitoring that. So we'll move on.
This might actually help answer the previous question. Common slugs. In the Mid-Atlantic, our most common slugs in ag fields are gray garden slugs, Duroceras reticulatum. And Sally, please correct me if I'm saying that wrong. We had a little bit of a debate yesterday on how you pronounce some of these names.
I try not to.
But the gray garden slug is kind of a creamy beige, light gray, sometimes with darker splotches. It's a fairly big slug. It's about, the adult is almost the size of my thumb. It produces a very milky defensive mucus. So if you're running around a field with a pin and you start poking slugs, the gray garden slugs will start exuding this milky white mucus. And you can kind of see that in this picture right at the tail end of the slug there. We've also got, and gray garden slugs, those are introduced. We have marsh slugs, which have a very cosmopolitan distribution. So we're not really sure where they're originally native to, but they're pretty much found worldwide at this point. They tend to be a very dark gray to a black color. They produce a clear mucus, and they're a bit smaller than gray garden slugs. And then we have Arion, which is a genus that has several species in it. This is the dusky slug. Typically in Delaware, it's no more than a mere handful of percentage points in the species complex. But in some fields, you can get a lot more of them than in others. In my garden, the most common species are marsh slugs and leopard slugs, which I rarely see in agricultural fields. Next slide. So in general, and this is a kind of a generalized version of the slug life cycle, and this is mostly for gray garden slugs. In the late summer, early fall, the slugs will start mating. They're hermaphrodites, but they still need to mate. And they're going to start laying eggs in the fall. Those overwintering eggs are going to be put underneath of residue in soil cracks, areas where the root system is starting to decompose on corn. So if you pull out corn stubble, you may find slug eggs in the soil there. Some adults will also overwinter, and that can be a function of winter severity. Adults that do overwinter will become active again in late winter, early spring, and continue laying eggs. So I took this photo on March 19th of 2020 of 2 adult gray garden slugs that had become active again, and they're starting to lay more eggs. Eggs will begin hatching in the early spring, somewhere anywhere from like the middle of March to middle of April. Some of those slug eggs were laid in the fall, and so they had a chance to develop partially before winter. Some were laid in the spring. So you can get this kind of extended hatch window in our area. Juveniles are associated with the greatest amount of crop injury. And then they'll feed and gradually grow in size throughout the spring and summer. This is applicable to gray garden slugs. Again, in kind of the Delmarva area. Other parts of the country may have a slightly different overwintering and egg hatching dynamic. Marsh slugs have a less well-defined winter overwintering strategy. So I can find marsh slug eggs, adults, juveniles, pretty much any time in the winter time. I can sometimes find neonates in the early fall. So they tend to be less synchronized. Probably the best way to put that. Next slide, please. So a couple of seasons ago, started a project funded through Soybean Board, and Sally and I started a project funded through Northeast IPM Center, looking at when those slug eggs are hatching. So this here is an example of some of the data that we were collecting. This is a field from Newcastle County. On the left side, we've got gray garden slug eggs. And it appears that they begin hatching at a pretty narrow time frame, at least in this particular year. Whereas marsh slugs are much less well defined. We've got adults, juveniles, hatchlings present pretty much all spring. I've got that red arrow in the field. The farmer ended up turbo tilling his field before he planted, and then there's a massive decrease in the amount of slugs that we were observing. But it's also getting warmer. We're going to touch on that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. And Sally sees some general trends in her slug abundance monitoring as well. Sally, do you want to comment on this?
This is only 2 years of data, but what it's really indicating is they're there and active starting from mid-April from when we start sampling and planting corn on. We do have usually that first peak of egg hatch is around mid-May for us. So you may find information from the Midwest and other states that encourage you to get out early and ahead of slugs, just something I certainly tried doing when I first came to Virginia. But increasingly with the mild winters, we're not able to beat them to the field. So we don't win that race before they hatch.
One more comment before we move on, Sally. I've heard some folks attempted to put slug bait in with a potash application in March, but to me it seems that our window of control is really towards middle of April through mid-May. Would you agree with that?
Very, very much so, especially given the longevity and the residual control of slug bait. It's not a month, even in the best of circumstances. So just don't do it.
And we'll touch on slug baits in a little bit as well. Next slide, please.
Oh, is this where I go?
Take it away.
We had a great slide of dogs licking slugs off glass, but anyway, it didn't load.
I couldn't get it to embed in the PowerPoint.
Entomologists have a weird sense of humor, and honestly, I think we deal with slugs because they're gross, and people just call us when they find gross things. So there are things that eat slugs, and I'm going to talk about biological control now. And for us in row crops, when I talk about biological control, I'm not talking about purchasing biological control agents, though certainly in some fruits and vegetables and nursery systems you can. And I'm not talking about things like intercropping to promote natural enemy populations, because it doesn't often fit into our operations that well on hundreds of acres. But there are things that you can do to conserve and promote biocontrol agents, and so cover crops can be part of that, and I'll touch on that. And then there are things like you don't want to do to mess up your biocontrol. So when we're talking about biocontrol and field crops, we're usually talking about conservation biocontrol. Next slide, please. So what eats a slug? Nothing really will eat an adult slug because they have something called a slime defense, and that's legit what it's called. And if you disturb them, they're going to mucus up. No one wants to eat that. So mainly when we talk about slug predators, we're talking about predators with juveniles, and those juveniles are and can be really small. There's a picture coming up with 1 1/4 to give you an idea of the size. One of the surprising predators we hit on in Virginia in the Mid-Atlantic region is the Opiliones, and that's the scientific name for daddy longlegs. They're also called harvestmen. So those really funky looking spiders that aren't spiders with the super long legs that make little girls and boys scream are slug predators. There are specialists on slugs. We have not found any of those in our areas. So they're generalist predators, but they do feed on slugs in studies somewhere between 5 and 10% of their diet. Next slide, please. We threw these funky ones in here. These are the slug and snail specialists. And we have a question in the chat I'll go ahead and get to now. Are slugs and snails the same thing? Yes, they are, except a slug doesn't have a shell. So the things that eat slugs and snails, if they're specialized for it, have the ability to crack that shell. Okay, next slide, please. Ground beetles are often in the literature as a slug predator. They're omnivores, so they can eat plants, but they are not plant pests. And they are generalist predators, so they're just out in your field killing and eating what they can find, and they like things like baby slugs and caterpillars, so we want to keep them around. Next slide, please.
One quick comment, Sally.
Yo.
There's a small group of ground beetles that are snail specialists. They're not very common in our area. They're much more common out in the Pacific Northwest. So
there are hundreds and hundreds of ground beetles that are predators that could be in your field. And we collected, I don't know, a few thousand as part of a project looking at what eats our slugs, and we did not hit on a specialist, not one. But it's really hard to identify these, and I encourage you to not try. But one thing you can do to know what a predator is think about what a predator looks like. So if you find a bug in your field and it's got eyes on the front of its head, if it's narrow and flat and fast, if it's got forward-facing mouth parts, it's designed to eat other things. If the eyes are on the side of the head, the mouth parts are facing down, it's built for defense and or, you know, hiding, it's likely not a predator. So think about the difference between a millipede and a centipede. So how are predators related to slugs? This is a graph of mine from a student that demonstrates the relationship between predator numbers and slug numbers. So on the vertical axis, you have total number of slugs found in a field, and on the horizontal, as you move from left to right, it increases the number of predators in a field. And what that red arrow indicates is where we have a lot of slugs, we don't have a lot of predators, and where we have a lot of predators, we don't have a lot of slugs. And each one of those little dots is a different field. Next slide, please, Jonah. When we break it down into the individual taxa of predators, where we find a lot of ground beetles, we don't find a lot of slugs. Next slide, please, Jana. Where we find a lot of harvestmen, we don't find a lot of slugs. Next slide, please, Jana. However, where we find a lot of wolf spiders, and this spider is pictured on this slide, this is not a web building spider. They travel all along the ground. You find them in the house a lot, and they're just roaming about looking for things to eat. And there is no relationship between this taxa and slugs. So they potentially could be eating other bugs and things you don't want in your field. Next slide, please, Jana. So we looked at the different characteristics and cultural practices of how you manage a field and the number of predators that you found there. And this is not broken down by taxa. What is indicated by the height of these bars is the total or the average number of predators caught per field. So the taller the bar is, the more predators are there. And all we're comparing is no-till with reduced till. And in this case, reduced till, we did find have more predators, and there could be some relationship to disturbance. So some species do like some amount of disturbance, some like none, and some like a whole lot. That's just biology. Okay, next slide, please. We did find that fields with cover crops had more predators. So the bar on the left is where we had cover crops in a field. The bar on the right is no cover crops, and we had more predators where there were cover crops. And again, that's back to that green bridge idea, is you have herbivores in there eating cover crops, and predators follow herbivores. Okay, next slide, please. What you can affect their ability or their capacity to survive in the field is whether or not you are using insecticides. So some people, and this is an old practice, I believe my father probably did it because insecticides used to be really super cheap, right? Is anything super cheap in 2022? I haven't found it. But what essentially I mean by pre-plant insecticides is when people put out a herbicide, burn down on their field either prior to or at planting, they'll throw in some pyrethroid or other broad spectrum insecticide to just knock out whatever else may be lurking in the system. And this is thought to be a smart practice for things like cutworms. But I really want you to think that if you're considering doing this, or this is something that you've done or you want to continue doing, is think about the last time you've had a cutworm outbreak. Because I don't think I've seen one in my adult life, but we tend to, especially as farmers, is keep those disaster scenarios in our head for a really long time. And so I think, oh, it might have been the 90s, you know, the 1990s weren't that long ago. Yeah, they were. We're old. It was a long time ago. I'm sorry to tell you. So I'm more than willing, David's more than willing to talk to you more about cutworms and other season pests and different kinds of plants like BT crops that can be somewhat tolerant to them, and different in-furrow insecticides or whatever you can use. But considering where you are, if you're in the mid-Atlantic, I think slugs are a greater risk to you. And I can definitely see slug disasters happening more frequently and at a higher level than cutworms. So this slide just shows if you use that pre-plant insecticide, you're not going to have many predators. Why? Because a lot of those predators are insects. The other thing is if you knock all the prey out of the system and some of those prey are neutral, completely neutral to your crop, they don't have anything to eat, they're going to leave. So don't use pre-plant broadcast insecticides. That's all that slide shows. Okay, next slide, Yana. Soapbox over. The other issue we have are insecticides applied to the seed coating. So if you're planting corn, you do not have the option, it's going to come with it on it. But they are optional adding seed treatments to soybeans. Soybeans will have some kind of fungicide or protectant on there, but it's optional whether or not you want an insecticide. There are different kinds of insecticides that can be applied to the seed coating. Neonicotinoids are by and large the most popular. They dominate the market, and they will not kill a slug because it's an insecticide. Next slide, please. But what's really screwed up is the slugs will eat the neonicotinoid seed, and that toxicant will now be in their bodies. And so the predators that feed on the bodies of those slugs will become intoxicated and die. So this is a trophic interaction where it's traveling through the body of the prey to intoxicate the predator. This is not bioaccumulation, but this is trophic transfer. What can happen with this is not only you're decreasing your predators, but your slugs are surviving higher, and there have been measurable yield decreases to using a seed treatment. I will give a caveat. This is not true for every state and every system. So as you move farther south and pest complexes change, the utility of that seed treatment increases. But speaking for us in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic, we do not see a benefit of using seed treatment and insecticidal seed treatments in soybeans, and in fact that they can be a detriment. Okay, next slide, please. I'll leave this to David.
So there is another group of biological control agents, that's nematodes. There is a species of nematode, Phasma rhabditis hermaphrodita. It's a European species that's been formulated into the product Nemaslug, which is available in Europe, not in North America. But this same species was recently discovered in California and in Oregon through some of the efforts of Pacific Northwest slug expert Rory McDonald. In 2018, University of Delaware, Ivan Hiltpold did a survey of slugs, and he found about 7% of the slugs that he collected in Delaware were infected with some nematode species. So shortly after he collected them, brought them into the lab, some of those slugs began melting down. And when you zoom into that, you got all these little white squiggles in the picture here. Those were all juvenile nematodes that are feeding on that decomposing slug and getting ready to disperse in the environment looking for more slugs. So Sally and I started collecting slugs last year to try to start understanding a little bit more about their prevalence. And we found two different nematode morphs in Delaware. We've got a large nematode that you can see without a microscope. And then we've got this really tiny nematode like the one on the left. And they didn't always kill those slugs very quickly. And they sometimes didn't kill those slugs before they laid eggs in the lab. So we don't know if these are commensal, if they're parasitic, or if they really shorten slug life expectancy and slug feeding. We collected them only out of marsh slugs. We didn't collect any out of gray garden slugs. And last year, about 15% of our slugs started melting down with nematodes. Sally, I don't recall, I don't think you found any in Virginia.
Not a one.
So unfortunately, our understanding of this nematode complex is extremely limited. We know very little about the factors that influence it in our fields. We don't even have a good species identification on them. And we know even less about their seasonal dynamics and what really controls whether or not they can be and under what conditions they will kill slugs. Next slide, please.
So we do have a few questions here. How many slug species do you usually find in the field? And can you share any slug ID resources?
We usually find the 3 that David had up. We've collected several thousand and not found something different. I'm not really good with slug IDs, so David may have a good ID resource. That where he had it, poking it is my best strategy. So if you poke it and it's milky, it's the gray garden slug. If you poke it and it makes a clear mucus, it's a garden slug. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. I'm sure there's a few other extension fact sheets that have better descriptions and pictures of them. But yeah, when I'm in fields, I can be in fields that have almost entirely marsh slugs, fields that have almost entirely gray garden slugs, and then a lot of fields that are, got both. But primarily those are the only 2 that I find. It's very rare when I find a dusky slug. So I get very excited.
Okay. So Great Staten asked, if planting field corn in green cover crop, when is the best time to burn down the cover to minimize slug damage?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question.
We're gonna have completely different answers.
Yes, there is some good research, and we're going to cover that here in the next segment, suggesting that planting green can help divert slugs away from a cash crop. But then if it's not done right, those cover crops can also make the environment more favorable to the slugs.
Yeah, I generally dislike rolling for that reason, is it tends to make this matted ceiling where they can just move about all day, with their little roof over their heads. In general, I like 2 weeks of a dead field before my seedlings come up, at least.
Okay, and we have some more questions, but I'm going to suggest, actually, let's ask one more that was about biological controls specifically. What are the biological controls that passed host specificity tests before release?
Oh, Mark, that's a deep question, my friend. And there's probably an APHIS expert that could give you a textbook on it. You can release a generalist predator, and those are usually native species. So that's like talking about putting like a ladybug out there, or an aureus, something that will just eat everything. But when you're talking about moving a native species from one country to another to fight an invasive, it's a very rigorous process that takes a long time and is hard to achieve.
Great. Well, I'm going to suggest we carry on because I think some of the questions that are here will be answered in the next section. So
yeah, we'll try to speed up.
So, there you go.
All right. So getting to cover crops and slugs. Sally, you've done quite a bit of work with different cover crops and feeding habits. Care to, I think you'll help answer Greer's earlier question on it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Take it away.
So slugs will eat a lot of stuff. They'll eat a live stuff and dead stuff. But like any other animal, they have a preference, and what they like to eat is gonna be different depending on what's available. Next slide, please. This is a study that my student did offering slugs the choice of what they would eat. And in this, she offered them a corn seedling with different cover crops. So they could only eat the corn or the cover crop that was placed with them. And what this graph shows is how much of that corn they consumed when the cover crop was present. So if we go from a 0 to a 4 on the vertical axis, 0 would be no feeding on the corn, 4 would be they ate the entire thing. So when they were offered corn with hairy vetch, they ate the vetch, they did not eat the corn. That was their preference. But when they were offered corn with daikon radish, and this daikon radish was killed prior to the study, or rye, they ate more of the corn. So that goes back to what kind of cover crop do you have? If you had a vetch, I would be more likely to leave it around a little bit longer and let your corn grow, because that's what they prefer to eat. If you had a rye, I wouldn't. Okay, next slide, please. This is the same study, but with soybean. And they did a little bit different. So they ate the most soybean seedling when they had crimson clover and rye offered with it. They ate the least amount of soybean when they had daikon radish and hairy vetch were offered. And you might think, well, hairy vetch looks good for me then, because they like to eat that about over anything else. I would caution that it's a very dangerous combination, putting vetch before soybean, because they're the same genus. Fabaceae, I think, is right for vetch too. And that means that they'll have the same herbivores and the same diseases. So just be cautious with that combination. Next slide, please. Okay, leave it to David.
So our most powerful slug management tactics are cultural. And one of those is to close seed slots. This is easier said than done. Typically in years that we have a lot of slug issues, we have a lot of rain. And rain makes it more, and wet soil makes it more difficult to get a good seed slot closure. But anything you can do to ensure that that seed slot is closed will set you up for better success, because that acts as a slug superhighway. It's dark, it stays moist longer, and it gives those slugs direct access to those germinating seedlings. So for soybeans, they can hollow out that swelling seed, or they can kill that seedling before it gets out of the seed slot. For corn can typically take more of a slug beating because the growing point stays underground, but if the slugs have direct access to that growing point underground, they can still take that out. Next slide, please. You also can take out the trash. And this is something that is encouraged in that SARE handbook that we had in our earlier slide, is row cleaners. This helps push residue away from the crop so that slugs aren't sheltering right at the base of the seedling. Soil warms a little bit faster, so you get faster germination. This can be effective in kind of lower population environments, or if you have a lower population but really favorable weather. That can make a difference between having just enough damage to make make a stand somewhat viable or less viable, and having just enough control to prevent that. The other thing I wanted to comment on this is, especially with thick cover crops, you also want to get that seed into the ground. So you got to manage that cover crop residue so that you get the seed in the ground instead of it lying on the soil surface. So there can be quite a bit of playing around with the equipment settings, depending on the amount of residue present. Next slide, please. And then waiting. This is probably the hardest advice. When it's time to jump in the pool right around Memorial Day, we've got warmer soil, drier conditions, and that can result in faster seedling growth, less slug activity. In other states, they suggest that planting early can help, so that you get more crop growth before you get peak slug egg hatching. And I don't see in our data that we've been collecting here on Delmarva that is a I think that we get enough slug eggs hatching earlier than when we would be planting crops. That is not necessarily a consideration, but that is something that it certainly is a regional difference worth looking into. Next slide, please. And this here's some data from Galen Dively. in which he showed that starter fertilizer for corn enables those seedlings to grow larger leaves and handle more slug feeding than seedlings without that starter fertilizer. And this was also associated with slightly higher yields, or at least a yield protection effect, as opposed to an outright yield improvement. So basically, the bottom line is anything that helps that seedling get out of the ground faster and more vigorously is going to set you up for success. Next slide, please. And then finally, tillage. We started off discussing no-till because that's primarily where slugs are a problem. So ground disturbance greatly reduces slug populations and activity. And it doesn't have to be a whole lot. You can still be in a conservation tillage environment and have enough soil disturbance to reduce slug activity. So that's particularly true with vertical or turbo tillage. Tillage also helps in drying and warming the soil, and that helps enhance germination. This here is a study from my predecessor, Joanne Whalen, where she had 4 fields that had vertical till versus no-till and slug activity under shingles. And in some fields, we went from like 2 slugs of slug and a half per shingle to maybe 1 slug or so. So it may be a 30 to 50% reduction in activity. You can still get some damage from that. But then in other fields, it was a big difference in slug reduction. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to get into some of our more remedial control efforts. So we're going to talk about scouting for slugs and slug baits. Next slide, please. So when we scout for slugs, there's a couple of ways to do it. The most common is to use some sort of shelter trap. This can be anything from shingles to cardboard to a piece of wood that fell in the field. Some people put pitfall traps underneath those shingles. Some people put fermenting bread dough underneath those shingles. But basically, they're going to hide from the sunlight and they're going to try to stay moist. So they're going to seek shelter in the early morning hours. With shingle traps, they're best examined in the early morning before the sun starts heating them up. Once they get hot, those slugs are going to leave them too. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a fun slide that one of Sally's students found on beer traps. Sally, do you want to make a few comments on this real quick?
Yes. So beer traps can be a waste of good beer, which no one wants, but they are a good excuse to ride around with a 6-pack on your truck if you work for the state. And we did have a comment in the chat about beer traps working well for homeowners, and sometimes they do, but the problem is, as you see, some slugs just drink and leave. It seems like the stupid ones maybe just fall in.
Next slide, please. So we've got quite a few varying extension recommendations for slugs underneath of shingles or under crop residue in a square foot situation. Yeah, anywhere from 1 to 5 per square foot is what I've heard. Pennsylvania suggests 1 slug per square foot for corn. Again, they have a slightly different growing environment than we have down here. So we don't really have good thresholds. And that's partly because they are so weather dependent. You get warm, dry weather right after you plant, and you can have a field that is loaded with slugs but not have any damage. Or you can have a field that doesn't have a whole lot of slugs in it, but if the soil temperature stays at 50 degrees and it's cloudy and rainy, even the few slugs that are present can still cause a lot of damage. So in the 90s, Byers and Calvin in Pennsylvania estimated that anywhere from 2 to 60% defoliation on corn would justify a slug treatment and start reducing yield. But again, that's very dependent on environmental conditions. Generally, cool, wet conditions at planting is going to put a field at higher risk, especially for soybeans before those unifoliates have expanded. Next slide, please. Galen Dively also did some work with applications of urea. And this can, under the right conditions, burn slugs. So this is the, he at 10 gallons per acre, he reduced the number of slugs by 70% on the plants. This is active as a contact burn. So you've got to apply it when the slugs are on the plants on a still, warm, humid night when those slugs are active. And this is for corn. You may still get some crop injury from that. And this is not going to work for soybeans. Next slide, please. And then we've got our chemical baits, metaldehyde and iron phosphates and sodium ferric chelates. So metaldehyde is most common under the trade name of Deadline or Deadline MPs. It's mildly toxic, especially when pets ingest it. It is metabolized into acetaldehyde. My apologies for misspelling acetaldehyde on this slide. And in the Pacific Northwest, it's one of the leading causes of accidental dog poisoning. So the UK is looking to ban outdoor use of Deadline. We do have iron phosphate baits, Ferox, Ferox AQ, and Sluggo. Sluggo is an organic approved option. These are much less toxic by ingestion. They damage the slug digestive tract, so they're slower acting. That slug is still going to reduce its feeding. And really, when we're talking about seedlings, we only need a fairly narrow window of protection. Next slide, please.
David, I will add that there are certain formulations of baits that include insecticides. So read the label of what you're purchasing and make sure that you need those added ingredients.
That's a good point. One of the old ones was Mesurol, which had a carbamate in it. And speaking of insecticides, there was a lot of work done between 2010 and 2015 with Lanate. Lanate is not effective as a slug killer.
Oh, and to the snail people, because they're snails and slugs are mollusks, these products will kill a snail.
So for Deadline, the maximum rate in soybeans is 10 pounds per acre. For corn, it's up to 25 pounds. If you can band that application right over the row, it's going to be more effective. So you get this concentration of slug pellets right where you need it. The labels on all of these products are going to have conversion tables for about how many pellets per square foot. But even with these low rates, it's very tricky to apply at just so. The other downside to slug baits is they're very expensive. They cost roughly around $2 a pound. That was prior to 2022. So the 2022 pricing and availability is a bit of an unknown. So as always, read your labels. One more quick comment about slug baits before I move off. The best time to apply them is when you have some moist weather, kind of warm weather. You put that bait out and it's followed by sunny, dry weather. And that's because, especially with Deadline, it basically screws up the slug's ability to produce a lot of mucus. So that slug is very immobile. It kind of gets stuck to wherever it's at. And then if you get a sunny weather, it'll help dry that slug out. These baits do not have a very long residual control, especially in heavy rain situations. And then heavy rains will also lead to the slug feeding on a sublethal dose as opposed to the full punch. Next slide, please.
Oh, this is one of Scott Stewart's slides from the University of Tennessee, and he was on the call earlier, but I think he might have had to step off. And why I'm showing it is it's got Deadline and Sluggo at the low and high rates and how well it worked. And for both of these products, percent control is the height of the bars. So both of them provide good equivalent control at different rates. What I never asked Scott about this study is what was the weather like, because where I have a tendency to use a higher rate is when I'm going into those unfavorable conditions like wetter, moisture weather, where I don't expect the product to work as good. Next slide. Oh, yay.
So
Take
lots,
it, David.
lots of folks have been funding slug research in the Mid-Atlantic. And I'm sure I'm missing a few of the sponsors. Some of the data that we've shared was from studies funded by Delaware Soybean Board, Maryland Soybean Board, Atlantic Soybean Council, Maryland Grain Producers Utilization Board, USDA NRCS, Northeast IPM Center, and USDA NIFA. But there's still a lot to be done with these critters, and they're very frustrating. They're one of my least favorite groups to get calls on because there's still there's so much environmental conditions that influence management for them. Sally, do you have any further closing comments?
I mean, just to say your best offense is a good defense. I don't know if I'm quoting Coach K there, but I'm a huge Duke fan. And just grow the best crop you can, and that's going to minimize the effect of slugs and every other pest in your system. But we know you're trying to do that anyway. One of the things that we developed through the University of Delaware, Virginia Tech, and other participating ag schools throughout the Southeast and Mid-South is an app for row crops. It's completely free. When I say row crops, I mean soybean, corn, cotton, peanut, and small grains currently, though we may be adding more. It's available for the Android and the Apple platforms. It's completely free. It's got thresholds, pest pictures, products you can use, the rates, special considerations. We're adding functionality to it all the time. So if you're interested in that, please contact me personally. It's being hosted not by the Northeastern IPM Center, sorry, Yana, but by the Southern IPM Center. And I can tell you how to get to that. I'll go ahead and put the link for it in the chat. Next slide, please.
There we go. So we have a couple of comments and questions that Danielle Sprague has said, are snails an issue for you as well? We're dealing with an invasive snail in Florida and Georgia. They may seem to be causing an issue in row crops, peanuts, soybeans, and cotton, where the high populations weigh down seedlings and at harvest can gang up the equipment, as well as potentially cause grade issue in peanut. In citrus, they're causing issues when they clog irrigation emitters and reduce irrigation efficiency. And we've recently developed a working group to look into this more. And the reason I wanted to read that out was because also Jean-Claude Ebenezer said this discussion is more about slugs. Can we have some advice on managing snails? They're the one causing damages in soybean and the bean fields. And so I just wanted to make sure that you had both seen that about the working group that Danielle referred to, and I don't know if she maybe could put a link in the chat for how folks could contact them about the working group if you might be interested in participating in that. So, and I don't. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
David, have you seen this in the Mid-Atlantic? Because I've seen it and I can speak about it, but I don't know that it's necessarily made it into the Northeast.
The only time that I've seen snails in soybean, there was a field that was applying wastewater. So they were applying it pretty frequently. And our plant pathologist thought that the field was suffering from much bigger pathological issues rather than the snails themselves causing issues. So that's the only time I've seen snails cause issues up here.
Okay, yeah, so we occasionally, I get calls. It is more common as you travel southeastern, and the issue in peanuts is even if you kill them, they leave their dead bodies to be contaminating loads. So that's what the comment was about in peanut. What we see in soybean in the mid-Atlantic that's made it to Virginia is you'll show up in a field and the seedlings will be laying over. And that's because they're covered with so many snails on the underside of the cotyledon and it's weighed the plant down. I've only been to maybe one field where they were actually feeding, and that was the issue. What will kill a slug will kill a snail, but overwhelmingly our problem is slugs for us. If you're writing because you have a problem unique to you in snails and you're in our area, we'd certainly love to hear about it because we're missing it. And then I tell my friend Silvana at the University of Florida that this freaking invasive snails make it us. That's the day I retire. But yes, I will participate in their working group to be like the no data state because we really don't want them. But they can all be a problem in your home garden, and you treat for them the same way. Honestly, the best thing for them is a sunny day that's 80 degrees. Knock them out. You can put barriers in your home garden that are quite effective. Just be careful when you're around children and pets using those baits.
Right, great. And I just do want to point out something in the chat that Vijay Nandla had put in from NIFA. He said, please note that there's a new program area priority in the 2022 AFRI Foundational Applied Sciences RFA on regional innovation and demonstration of climate smart agriculture and future farms. And he's put a link to that in the chat if anyone is interested in that. Amy Rhoda said, do the natural enemies keep slug populations below damaging economic thresholds? And can they prevent the need for baits?
I think we have evidence that they can. You know, just where we see a healthy, thriving predator community, we don't see slug outbreaks. The problem is sometimes things tip out of balance in our agroecosystems, and our predator parasite response lags behind our pest infestation. And that's where we run into trouble. And we sometimes know what upsets that balance in terms of insecticides, but sometimes we don't. And that's just ecology, that when you have a large influx of prey, predators are going to lag behind it. And that lag can be enough to lose your crop, which is why we have things like chemical controls to step in. But ideally, we maintain that balance and harmony, and we don't need slug baits. But
The other thing
Amy also asked if there are any reports of resistance or behavioral resistance. I guess the behavioral resistance when they're drinking the beer and going away.
there is a Rory McDonald has a really good fact sheet on slug baits, and in it he explains that if a slug ingests a sublethal amount of metaldehyde, they are more likely to avoid further metaldehyde baits. In his environment, slugs are active and need control on crops pretty much from October until the spring. So some fields get baited multiple times. In our area, if a slug ingests a sublethal amount of a bait, that might still be enough to prevent it from causing damage to the seedling under the critical time that we need to protect it.
And then Michael Gardner asked, do you have any advice for slug and snail control in green peas near harvest?
Michael, do you know, can you tell me where you are in the country? Brian Nault up in New York ran into that issue a couple of seasons ago with slugs being a contaminant issue with peas. I don't know of any good rescue for that besides, warm, dry weather, which, when peas are ready to harvest, they have to be harvested. So that's not very helpful. My understanding is most slug baits have restrictions on the label not to apply once the crop is blooming. In our area, we pretty much till all of the ground that gets planted into peas. So I don't run into slug issues in peas. I run into seed corn maggot issues, which are favored by tillage. But I think that's one of those freak weather events that can cause them to be a contaminant problem. But if if you want to bounce that off of Brian Nault, feel free. I'll put his email in the chat too, and that way you'll have it.
Okay, great, thank you. And Diane Dodge said, have you ever seen a small farm using ducks for snail and slug control? I've heard they love slugs and snails and are one of the few animals that do.
Oh, I love you, Diane. That's an awesome question. I'm glad we got to it. David, can I take this one?
Go for it.
I wouldn't, and that's just because adult slugs can make animals sick, and that's more common in Europe and the UK because it's actually an introduced something in the slugs that is making the animals sick. So if your animal is inclined to naturally eat a thing, I leave that animal alone, but I wouldn't try to like move my ducks into a field to provide that kind of control, because the other issue is if you're eating those ducks, they're not going to taste good if they're eating slugs. I don't know if like you shoot and eat a lot of ducks, and I do, and what they eat is very much translated into how they taste. So if I was a farm that had ducks, and I would not do that to my ducks. But if that's a natural part of their diet, have at it. I just wouldn't encourage it.
Okay, great, thank you. And someone else also, I don't know if people saw this in the Q&A, but someone else asked if slugs and snails are the same, can they be used for escargot? I think it's half joking, but Sally did respond that in California is having a problem with snails and that had been introduced as food. And but the same thing, you wouldn't eat them for a lot of money, even if it was covered in garlic butter.
Yeah, I read that last night instead of sleeping, was that California imported snails for food purposes, and now they're loose and becoming a pest to other crops.
Great.
That was a great question. If you saw your question disappear, I may have answered it in the chat. I tried to answer a few because I knew we wouldn't get to all the snail stuff.
Great. All right, well, we'll continue. We have a poll for you with some questions that, there we go, should pop up. There's only 2 questions, so it should be super easy. And I'll just give you some time to answer those.
And we thank you for answering questions. It's part of our jobs to demonstrate that audiences listen to us. And I know that we didn't provide you every answer you want, because every answer you want isn't there. And that's what makes slugs such a crappy issue for us and you. As I tell people all the time, I'm not a chemist. I wish I was. Like I don't have a magical cure in my back pocket. If I did, I probably wouldn't be at this job. Let's be real. I'd have sold it and retired. And congratulations to Nancy. If you read her newsletter like I do, we're losing her soon to retirement. So best wishes on the road, Nancy.
Thank you.
All right.
You know, any good applicants, send them our way.
They may be on this call.
There you go. All right, I'm going to assume the people who haven't responded yet might be in a position where they can't respond if they're driving or something. So as a result of the webinar, how knowledgeable do you now feel? Most people felt moderately or very knowledgeable, and still there's that one person who's extremely knowledgeable, Kate probably came on that way. And then how likely are you to increase your implementation of IPM? Very likely and extremely likely were the 2 largest respondents to that, which is great news for us. And I want to point out that we have this Find a Colleague website. So if you're interested in other people who are interested in slugs and snails, and you can post a profile here on this website, and say what you're interested in. And you can also search it for other people who are interested in the same topics. Now, it's a great way of increasing collaboration across the Northeast. And we set this up for the Northeast, but by all means, if you're in the South, one of the other areas, feel free to take a look at it and post a profile there if you'd like to. A recording of this is going to be available probably this time next week. We should have it available and on the website, and I'll send anyone who's registered, I'll send you a link, but it will also just be on our website. If you came back, a week from now, it should just be sitting there. We have one last research update, a toolbox webinar coming up, taking a closer look how strawberry disease risk varies across microclimates at the canopy level. And that's going to be on May 4th. We have also been having a series of toolboxes recently and a research update conference. And the recordings of those are available on our website. So if there's other topics that you're interested in, please take a look, because we've had some really interesting presentations recently. We did one on tarping that was really fascinating, as have the other things. We did one on pesticides last week too. I want to acknowledge that the Northeastern IPM Center is based at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. And the Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono Nation. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of the Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. This land acknowledgement has been reviewed and approved by the traditional Gayokono leadership. We also want to acknowledge that this presentation and some of the research that's been presented, I'm sure, has been funded through NIFA, the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, Crop Protection and Pest Management Program. We have a grant through their regional coordination program, and we wouldn't be able to make this toolbox series or anything else possible without it. So we're deeply appreciative. And finally, I want to say a note of appreciation to David and Sally for all of your work and your tireless efforts, and the hours and hours and hours of studying and time out in the field and crunching numbers and time in the lab, and we really appreciate it. And actually, I also want to acknowledge this will be the final toolbox for Nancy Cusimano that many of you know, because she sends the weekly roundup, and she is the brains behind that operation and many other things at the center. And she will be retiring at the end of the month, and we're heartbroken and also looking for her retirement. So I just want to let you folks know and just publicly say thank you for everything that Nancy does for us. I don't know if we'll quite function ever again in the same way. And so anyway, with that note, I'll say thank you to everybody for being here today, and we look forward to seeing you in another Toolbox webinar.